Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bowes. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. It's great to be with you today. We had our annual dinner event in Spokane on Friday, which, if you were there, I'm positive you had a great time. And I hope you'll let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. If there's any feedback you'd like to provide, just send it to me via email. I'd enjoy hearing from you about that. But I've myself found it wildly informative and interesting and compelling. We had Dr. Robert Marbut and Stephen Baldwin deliver a fantastic discussion about the homeless issue and the problems there. They had toured Spokane. They even witnessed an overdose while they were there that occurred just down the road from where they were, and that seems to be a recurring theme of that kind of challenge there. And coincidentally, when I brought my kids to school the day before here in Tacoma, I was somewhat horrified because of what was going on just behind the scenes when I was driving them in. So there was a fellow who was just stark naked, doing his business on the side of the road within 100 yards of their school. And I'm trying to distract my kids from seeing that kind of thing. So it's this pervasive societal problem with all kinds of complexities. And it was really interesting to hear about where they saw solutions working and where they saw them not working. And it was also interesting to see that left-right unity there, where they were coming together in certain approaches. They still differed in some things, but it was still fascinating. Then Dennis Prager delivered a philosophical discussion about some of the dangers of big government and the nature of what to look for and what to watch for, and why it is that limited government is an inherent good and a necessary good and a wonderful thing. And I enjoyed thoroughly all of that. Right now, though, I'd like to turn our attention to our Center Director for our Cole Center for Transportation. Charles Prestrud is with us and agreed to update us. While we were on our way to Spokane, I was getting some updates from Charles regarding what was going on with some areas of transportation and some of newfound expenses that were being announced, specifically by Sound Transit. And Sound Transit, I should add, they've had a history of problems galore. And it's almost, I mean, I've said this before, it's difficult to track how many problems and overruns and false promises and other things Sound Transit's had. It's shocking to me how they can get away with having launch parties and positive commercials without laughter taking place. But it's based on my own experience here. But last week, Sound Transit provided an updated cost estimate for extending light rail to Seattle. And the Seattle Times reported the new price tag at least $1 billion higher than the number Sound Transit was using just a year ago. Charles, what's going on with that project? Why the big increase, and what's the context that we're missing here?
Well, the cost increase for the West Seattle extension was a surprise. Maybe not a total surprise, but the amount of the increase was. The original cost estimate for that extension, when the plan was approved back in 2016, was about $1.6 billion. Seemed like quite a bit at the time, but anyway, in 2023, revised cost estimate was provided by Sound Transit. They were looking at about $4 billion at that time. The line's only a little over 4 miles long, so you're talking about $1 billion a mile to build a light rail line, which makes it one of the most expensive in the world. And then the final EIS was issued just a week or so ago, and the cost was up to $5.5 billion. But it turns out that with further refinement of their cost estimates, they're now saying it'll be over $6 billion. And keep in mind, those cost increases are before construction even starts. So I'm afraid there's still plenty of room for more bad news once you go out there and start buying property and letting contracts and so on. Anyway, they are very far over budget, so much so that it really busts their financial plan. They're bumping up against their debt limit, so they will either have to delay the project, which has already been delayed, or find additional revenue, which is tough because they're already exercising all the revenue taxing authority that the legislature gave them. Or as a very last resort, they could reconsider whether light rail is really even the appropriate technology to connect West Seattle with the rest of the region.
That's fascinating to me. 1.6 billion to what, over 6 billion now before construction even starts. Can you think of, can you think of any project that has had similar overruns like this that over a sustained period of time? I can't think of anything like it offhand.
Um, most major construction projects in the public sector in the last few years have had cost overruns, often due to just overall inflation. But this one is exceptional because you're looking at roughly tripling in cost or more in the span of about 7 years, and we're not sure that the end is even in sight. So clearly somebody significantly underestimated the difficulty and costs associated with this project.
Yeah, I'm just imagining, if construction starts, once it starts, what might happen after that. I think you mentioned in the Spokane dinner, it's taken, what is it, for the North-South Freeway in Spokane, a 10-mile stretch. They've got, what was it, 7 miles built, and it's taken 23 years, something like that.
Yeah, construction began, ground was broken in, I believe, 2020, or excuse me, 2001. So it's been 23 years. and that was largely due to kind of the stop and go funding the legislature provided because,
Yeah.
The project wasn't popular in some parts of the state, and money ran short. And the result was it has taken them a lot longer and cost a lot more than they had planned.
Still fascinating to me to see how long things take versus, how long things used to take and what the differences are. Has Sound Transit, back to the West Seattle link there, has Sound Transit looked at alternatives? You mentioned maybe, thinking about whether or not light rail is the best way to go on that. And I'm wondering, do you get the sense that they are meeting to see, hey, maybe we need to rethink the light rail approach here and do something else?
Well, what they did was look at different light rail alternatives, that is, different light rail alignments from downtown to West Seattle. And what their analysis shows is there aren't any good ones. Even the preferred alternative is problematic because you have to get through downtown Seattle and through Sodo, and that's complicated because the area is built up. Then you have to get across the Duwamish River, which is a navigable body of water. So you need a very high bridge to allow marine traffic. Then when you get into West Seattle, you've got residential neighborhoods and businesses, and also a lot of hills. That means neighborhood impacts, expensive construction, expensive right-of-way acquisition. And, it just makes for a very complicated, very expensive project. The funny thing is, we already know that bus rapid transit between West Seattle and downtown is entirely feasible because Metro provides rapid ride bus service along the same route. They do that today, and it's really pretty successful. In contrast, for light rail, even if you spent $6 billion on it, it wouldn't be much of an improvement in terms of travel time or the number of stops served. So to answer your question, Sound Transit is, of course, looking at ways they can reduce costs. But as long as they're building light rail, it's very hard to do. One possibility, which they don't really like, is to shorten the line and build what they call a minimum operable segment. But that would only add one station in West Seattle in the Delridge neighborhood. And that means it's practically useless for anyone in West Seattle who's trying to get anywhere else in West Seattle. So that is not an attractive alternative, and of course, it would also greatly reduce ridership, but would still cost probably $3 or $3.5 billion. It's an awful lot of money for minimal improvement.
In that scenario, would they stop the bus rapid transit, or do they just cannibalize riders, or how does that work?
I haven't seen the service plan, but presumably for any of the alternatives that extend light rail to West Seattle, it would probably replace Metro's rapid ride bus service, which means that most of the light rail riders are already transit riders. You're just shifting them from a more economical mode that's already there for a much more expensive rail service.
And that makes the expense, the $6 billion and counting proposed expenditure for that rail all the more unjustifiable, I think.
Yes.
Is there an environmental case for light rail as opposed to the bus rapid transit? Because that would be popular in the Seattle area, of course.
Well, we don't think so. The Washington Policy Center hired an independent researcher, John Niles, who's very capable when it comes to this kind of analysis. And he discovered that so much energy would be consumed in building Sound Transit's light rail extension that even if you believe their ridership forecasts, they never break even on the greenhouse gas emissions. And this is because it takes an enormous amount of energy, diesel fuel, gasoline, electricity, to dig the tunnels, to make the cement, tens of thousands of tons of cement, build bridges, and all the energy that goes into making steel rails, copper wire, retaining walls, and so on. So if anyone thinks that we need to do this to save the planet or to meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets, they're fooling themselves. If there is any benefit, it is just tiny, and it is more likely that it would contribute more greenhouse gases than it would reduce.
That's really interesting too, because you'll see Sound Transit's no slouch when it comes to advertising their own environmental benefit to people. And I'm assuming that they have access to the same information we do, and a lot more money than we do to discover such things, and yet they're very focused on positioning themselves as the green alternative, so to speak.
But people want to believe that because the trains run on electricity, they must be environmentally beneficial, but that ignores all the impacts from the construction, and those are very substantial. Sound Transit also typically assumes changes in travel behavior, that people will live close to the stations, they'll drive less, and they assume that there will be significant emissions reductions as a result of that. I think those are very speculative, partly because they may not get the ridership they forecast, and because many of the riders, as we already discussed, are already transit riders. So it's not like they're leaving gas guzzlers at home. Furthermore, by 2035, most of the new cars sold in this state will be electric vehicles anyway. So, if we're talking about emissions, it's electric trains versus electric cars versus electric buses. There isn't a big advantage there.
Hey, I've just got a message from Heidi here. She'd like you to speak a little closer to the microphone if you could, because of the volume differences there that sometimes plays havoc on Zoom. But I had just a quick follow-up on Sound Transit. I've had people say, well, look, that's a Seattle problem. It's a Seattle Metro problem. It's going to hit parts of the Seattle Metro area, which is, Snohomish through Pierce counties. But that's a you problem, not a we problem. Is there an opportunity cost because of the expense of Sound Transit? Is there an impact on the potential for state transportation priorities there? Because I think the last time we talked, we had talked about how the budget for road and highway maintenance is the new estimates are even we're in an even bigger hole than was estimated a year ago, and it was no slouch then. Does Sound Transit have an impact on any of that, or is it really just the regional problem for a bulk of the population, of course, but is it a regional problem, or does it have statewide implications?
Well, because Sound Transit is an entity separate from state government, they have their own dedicated revenue. They, up until now, have not relied upon state subsidy, at least not directly. They have indirectly. And there isn't really any easy way to take revenue from Sound Transit and use it to address the state's huge backlog in highway projects and highway maintenance needs. But Sound Transit does have an impact in another way, and that is they are spending so much that it has driven up the price for all kinds of civil engineering projects. The bid climate is just very unfavorable, and it has been really since ST2 passed back in 2008. There's a limited number of firms that do that kind of work, and they have gotten very picky about the projects they'll pursue, and they bid high. And that's not just for Sound Transit. It has driven up the costs for all kinds of public sector transportation projects, resulting in significant cost increases, not just for WSDOT, but for cities and Metro and everybody else.
If you have questions for Charles, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can type them in and we'll work them into our conversation. At any point, if you have a question, just use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, if you would. I noticed some of you using chat, which is a little bit harder for me, but there was one comment from Janice saying that North-South Freeway in Spokane is useless to people living on the west side of town. She describes it as a boondoggle of sorts. Is it supposed to reach everybody, or is there a point to that she might be missing there, or is she onto something there, Charles?
I haven't looked closely at the traffic analysis done for that project. It is true that it doesn't do a lot for people who live on the west side of Spokane, but that wasn't really its purpose. It will have significant benefits because there's increasing truck traffic, and the North-South Freeway provides a good connection between I-90 and Highway 2. It should also take traffic off Division Street and some of the other north-south streets in Spokane, which is good. But it is an expensive project. There's no doubt about that. And it's more beneficial for some people than for others.
On the Washington State Ferry's electrification program, last week there was news of the ferry system's first conversion of diesel to hybrid electric power that had been delayed. I feel like delayed is the operative word in almost every Washington State Ferry story that we've talked about this year or last year for that matter. What's the story here? Why is the conversion of diesel to hybrid electric power, why is that being delayed again?
Well, we should be clear here that in addition to the 5 new hybrid electric ferries that the ferry system hopes to purchase, they are also converting 3 of the existing jumbo Mark II ferries to hybrid electric power. And what they announced last week was about the first of those older ferries that are being converted. And that's the ferry Wenatchee, which went into the shipyard a year ago for that conversion. The ferry was due for its midlife rehab, and the ferry system had been planning for several years to, instead of just replacing the diesel engines with new diesel engines, they'd swap out a couple of them and put in batteries and make it hybrid electric. That work was supposed to be done this fall, but we just learned that it will be close to another year before the work is completed. What we don't know yet is how much the price has gone up. And we don't know the details of, could they not get some of the custom-made components that are needed for the hybrid electric power system, or there are other design and engineering issues that came up. I don't know the details, but a year's delay or near to it is a substantial delay. And as far as the price, that hasn't been announced yet either. But as you know, when a ferry goes into the shipyard, the meter is running from day one, and it will end up costing substantially more because an awful lot more labor and time is going to go into the conversion. This also raised the question of whether these conversions to hybrid electric power really make economic sense. The initial thought, and this was several years ago, was that the upfront costs, which are higher for hybrid electric power, would be offset by fuel cost savings in the future, over the next 15, 20 years while the boat is operating at least part of the time on electric power. But I'm not sure the assumptions that they made several years ago are still valid. For instance, City Light has recently announced a series of rate increases that will raise the price of electricity by more than 30% by 2030. And if Initiative 2117 passes, the price of diesel fuel will actually be lower. And that'll save the ferry system several $1 million per year for its diesel powered ferries. So it's very much an open question whether the fuel cost savings that had been assumed are going to be realized or whether there will be any fuel cost savings at all.
Question for you from Heidi. She writes, what are your thoughts on the 10,000-page environmental impact statement for the interstate bridge replacement?
This is the I-5 bridge across the Columbia River, and I have to admit I have not read that document yet. As Heidi has pointed out, it is a rather lengthy document. I will get to it, so I can't comment in detail, but there are a lot of questions about that project. It's another one where the cost of the project has already increased by several $billion. And the big question in my mind, in addition to cost, is it includes a light rail line that would extend from Portland to Vancouver, Washington. And that is an expensive element, but ridership on C-Tran, which is the Clark County Transit Agency, and on Portland's TriMet are both much lower now than they were 10 years ago. So if you're forecasting ridership increases as a result of this light rail extension, I want to know what they're assuming that warrants that increase in ridership. I think it is highly likely that under a realistic set of assumptions, it would be very hard to justify spending $1.5 or $2 billion on a light rail line that isn't going to carry very many more people than are riding express buses on that part of I-5 today.
You'd think I'd catch on to muting myself at this point at this point in the post-COVID Zoom popular days, but sorry about that. Oh no, I was just asking about a quick follow-up on the ferry system. Does the latest shipyard delay have implications for restoring ferry service that was cut during the pandemic, at least getting us back to some kind of close to normal?
Well, that's a good question. For most of this summer, the ferry system had only 15 boats in service when it takes 18 to operate the full schedule. With the ferry Wenatchee out of service for another year, the ferry system has to scramble to move their boats around to provide as much service as they can. What they plan to do is postpone the conversion of the ferry Tacoma, which is next in line to be converted to hybrid electric power. It had been scheduled to go into the shipyard this year, but that's going to be pushed out at least another year. The bottom line is that the ferry system is still short of boats and will continue to be until probably 2029 or perhaps later. Depends some on how soon they're able or forced to retire some of the creaky old ferries that they're trying to keep running. The other unknown is whether the new hybrid electric ferries, the new ones that they're hoping to have built, can be obtained on the schedule the ferry system has assumed. Now, originally, the first of those boats was supposed to enter the fleet in 2027. Now they're talking about maybe the summer of 2028 for the first ones, but they don't have a signed contract yet, so I wouldn't take bets on a delivery date for those yet. And so what this means is that service will not be fully restored to pre-COVID levels for another 3 years at best, and it may prove to be longer than that. In the meantime, the challenge will be to keep the creaky 50 and 60-year-old ferries running. The ferry system, I have to give them credit, really did a remarkably good job this last summer, better than they did in 2023, in keeping the old ferries in service. On-time performance wasn't real good, but at least they kept the ferries running. So they've got several more years to go before the new boats are in service. If you're planning on going to the San Juans or venturing across the Sound, keep that in mind.
Private charter time is what you're saying. What about if, I was curious about the ferry system and its delays. If we've been talking about this many times, predicting years of future delays based on the data that you've looked at and past being an indicator of what's going to happen next for the ferries. Is there an alternative for them to do something that would, let's say they abandon, the idea of everything has to be electric and all this. Is there a faster method? If somebody came in and said, "Look, we're gonna redo this. We're gonna focus on delivering the best service as fast as possible. That's our priority. Safety and good service." Is there an alternative to the years of delays that we're looking at now, or is it basically there is no good way out of this? We're just going to be stuck with these years of extra delays.
There is no good way out of it.
Yeah,
that's what is open to debate is whether they could get new ferries faster and cheaper if they went with clean diesel instead of hybrid electric. My sense is they probably could, because I think there are more shipyards ready to build those. And certainly, the design process is simpler. But, the ferry system has claimed that, they've already issued the request for proposals for the hybrid electric boats, and they have interest from shipyards around the country, and they don't want to take a step back and restart the process with clean diesel with a clean diesel ferry design. So at this point, we're kind of stuck with the current direction, and it'll be interesting to see probably early next year when the bids finally come in on those hybrid electric boats, how much they cost and whether the shipyards can meet the delivery timeline.
One last final question from the audience here. Who are the bidders for the new ferries? And I guess I'll add to it, is there an appropriate number of bidders to make it a competitive process for these electric ferries? Or, because in the past there's been controversy because the ferry system basically has limited itself to one place that could actually build them and then opens up for bids, but there's only one place that can do it, so why bother anyway?
Well, what happened is in the old days, there were a lot more shipyards in the Puget Sound region that could build ferries. And the legislature, because it wanted to protect that industry in Washington state, passed a law that required the ferry system to buy their ferries from shipyards in Washington state. In 2023, I believe it was, the legislature was very unhappy because the ferry system had not been able to reach agreement with Vigor Industries, which is the shipyard in Seattle. And they said, there's only one or two shipyards in the Puget Sound region that are still able to build these boats, so there's no competition when we are trying to shop around. So they passed a new law that directed the ferry system to open up the bidding process to shipyards all over the United States. They can't go overseas, which would be much cheaper because of federal law. So we don't know who's going to bid on the hybrid electric contract yet for the new build. The ferry system has been out knocking on doors. They've been advertised widely. I believe that Vigor Industries in Seattle and Nichols Brothers and Everett Shipyard up in Everett are interested, but I don't know who's going to bid. They may team up. We'll just have to wait and see.
Well, thank you, Charles. Appreciate your input today. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
You bet. I will post the video of this up on our YouTube channel. So for those of you who missed it, or if you know someone who would like to see Charles and his information, I'll post it up on our YouTube channel and then link it to our blog as well at washingtonpolicy.org. So you'll be able to see it there. Also, I did want to note the passing of our former governor, Dan Evans. Over the course of the weekend, we heard about the passing of Dan Evans, and I do intend to, there was a number of people I wanted to talk to about his legacy, his approach to policy and to governing. I had the pleasure of meeting him at one point on a series of meetings, and he was a remarkable and intelligent and gracious individual. And so we'd like to do that, but we're going to do it on a future date. So you can watch your emails for those who have subscribed to being noticed for our Zoom meetings. I'm trying to arrange that, and it's possible that it will be a special episode. So on a date that has not yet decided, but on a date coming up, probably not a Tuesday, but on a date coming up. And if so, just watch your email for that invitation for that special broadcast that we'll be doing. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. Thank you for joining us here on Washington Policy on the Go, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next episode.